Hey guys, imagine you wake up to a skyline where minarets mingle with neon. The air is thick with spiced coffee and diesel, and your hollow headline blares. The Ottoman Empire never fell. You feel equal parts curious, uncomfortable, and a little thrilled. Before we dive, hit like if alternate histories keep you up at night. Tell me in the comments where you'd move in this world. And dim the lights, because this version is gorgeous and a touch ruthless. You walk a bazaar that smells of cardamom and hot metal. Hear languages folding into each other like a messy playlist. And watch sultans commute on electric bicycles past Ottoman-style skyscrapers. You can almost feel the city's pulse under your shoes. This isn't fantasy dressing in silk. It's plausible forks in history, different treaties, delayed collapses, and reforms that meet steam engines. So yes, trade routes, borders, and even the shape of your smartphone get remade. What happens to Europe? Colonization, identity, and passports. When Constantinople becomes the tech capital, instead of a museum piece, exciting, terrifying, or both. Stick around, drop your wildest what if below. And if you want history with a wink and some hard facts, we're just getting started. The year is 1920, and Istanbul hums like a brass band on a caffeine binge. Vendors shout over the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the scent of spiced kebabs mingling with coal smoke that paints the Bosphorus a permanent sepia tone. In every courtyard, freshly painted flags flutter, proclaiming a rejuvenated Ottoman Empire that survived the Great War by swapping swords for school books and railways. Cafes spill out onto cobblestones, where men in silk fez debate the latest reforms, while sipping thick Turkish coffee that leaves a bitter mustache on their lips. Even the gulls seem to squawk in triumph, as if they know the empire's heart still beats strong beneath the unbroken crescent. Inside the marble-clad imperial palace, young Vizier Selim Al-Khan adjusts his cufflinks, a nervous habit that makes his sleeves twitch like a cat's tail. Across the polished floor, Elise von Hartmann, a European diplomat with a reputation for dry wit, eyes the ornate mosaics as if they might whisper back secrets. Their meeting begins with a polite bow, but Selim's eyes flash with the fire of a reformist who just discovered Wi-Fi. He's eager to connect the old world to the new. Elise, skeptical yet intrigued, offers a sardonic smile, noting that the empire's latest modernization feels like giving a horse a treadmill. The two exchange pleasantries that crackle like static, each wondering whether the other is a friend, a foe, or merely a very well-dressed pawn. Outside the palace walls, the city's veins pulse with rumors of nationalism rising like yeast in warm dough. In the bazaars, shopkeepers whisper about Serbian agitators and Bulgarian brigands, their voices low enough to avoid the ever-watchful ear of the janissary turned police. The scent of incense battles the acrid tang of gunpowder from a distant drill, a reminder that the Balkans simmer like a pot about to boil over. Selim hears these murmurs and feels the weight of his ancestors' swords, while Elise notes that the Ottomans' diplomatic playbook now reads more like a Netflix binge watch list, full of cliffhangers. The irony is thick. An empire that once conquered continents now worries about a teenager in Sofia posting protest memes on a telegraph line. Back in the palace's grand hall, Selm and Elise sit beneath a chandelier that flickers like a malfunctioning lightsaber, casting jittery shadows on the Persian rugs. Selim leans forward, his voice low, describing a daring plan to cement the empire's influence by sponsoring a railway that would snake from Istanbul to the Aegean, promising faster travel than a cheetah on a caffeine rush. Elise raises an eyebrow, retorting that the only thing moving faster than that train will be the gossip about it, especially when the press starts comparing Ottoman engineers to the Avengers of infrastructure. A nervous chuckle ripples through the room as a servant accidentally drops a tray of figs, the sweet pulp splattering like a burst of confetti. The moment, absurd and sticky, underscores the fragile balance between grand ambition and everyday clumsiness. As the evening deepens, the palace's echoing corridors become a theater for the future, each footstep a drumbeat heralding a world that might have taken a different turn. Selim and Elise, now bound by a tentative alliance, glance at the night-lit skyline where minarets pierce the moon like giant ice cream cones, daring the heavens to swallow them. They both sense that the Balkan crisis could either ignite a new Ottoman renaissance or set off a chain reaction that would rewrite history faster than a TikTok trend. With a shared, half-serious toast to an empire that refuses to fall, and to diplomats who can't resist a good plot twist, they seal a pact that could reshape continents. The unbroken crescent glows above, promising that the story of this empire is far from over, and the audience, past, present, and future, should buckle up. Sultan Selim, the visionary, stood on the soot-blackened balcony of Topkapi, eyes glittering like fresh steel rails. He shouted orders for iron tracks to snake from Istanbul to the Anatolian plains, promising that the empire would outrun its own legends. Workers in oil-stained overalls hammered and swore, the clang of hammers echoing like 1,000 drums of war. The scent of coal and fresh-cut timber mingled with the sweet perfume of incense, a bizarre perfume of progress and tradition. Even the old Janissary veterans muttered, "If this is the new Janissary, I hope they bring better coffee." Across the Bosphorus, Elise von Hartmann scribbled furiously in her leather notebook, sending telegrams that crackled like fireflies in a storm. She reported to Berlin that factories were belching smoke taller than the minarets, and that silk merchants now traded in steel bolts as if they were pearls. The Germans, half impressed and half bewildered, imagined a steam-powered Ottoman Empire as the world's most exotic locomotive. In the tavern, the scent of spiced kebab clashed with the oily tang of machine grease, making the locals wonder whether they were at a feast or a garage. Elise added a wry footnote. If Napoleon had a steam engine, he might have taken a vacation in Istanbul. In the shadowed chambers of the Yeni Meklis, reformist youths whispered plans louder than the whistles of the new locomotives. They wore crisp suits instead of the janissaries' fezzes, brandishing pamphlets like swords, promising schools, voting rights, and a parliament that didn't sound like a prayer chant. The janissary remnants, still clinging to their curved sabers, and the smell of gunpowder, snarled that the empire's soul was being melted in a furnace of foreign ideas. Skirmishes erupted in the bazaar, where the clatter of pistols mixed with the hiss of steam, and the air tasted of copper and cumin. The city's pigeons, fed on breadcrumbs and coal dust, circled above like bewildered commentators on a reality TV showdown. Meanwhile, the British Navy slipped sleek, gray ships into the Aegean, their flags fluttering like impatient eyebrows. They dropped a subtle blockade of the Dardanelles, a thin line of cannon smoke that smelled of salt and burnt rope, enough to make Ottoman merchants choke on their tea. British admirals sipped brandy on deck, while watching Ottoman steamers grind to a halt, their engines coughing like a dragon with a sore throat. The Ottoman coast guards, armed with pistols and pride, shouted curses that bounced off the water like ricocheting jokes. The tension rose so sharply that even the gulls seemed to wear tiny helmets, as if the whole scene were a low-budget historical action movie. Across continents, diplomats trembled like teacups on a rattling train, wondering whether to send more troops or more telegrams. The world watched the Ottoman Empire's steam-powered renaissance as if it were a season finale of a wildly unpredictable series. Selim's iron horse thundered toward the horizon, dragging the old empire into a future that smelled of oil, incense, and the occasional burnt kebab. Yet the clash of sabers and pistols, of tradition and turbines, promised a finale that could rival any superhero showdown, only with more beards and less capes. In the end, the empire's fate hung on whether the Yeni Meklis could outwrite the Janissaries' ancient ballads, a drama as juicy as any binge-watch binge. In the smoky taverns of Sarajevo, a wiry man named Arif Beylit a fire that was more than just a hearth. With a silver tongue and a scarred cheek, he sang revolutionary verses that made the crowd's blood thrum like a drumbeat. The scent of spiced raki mingled with the stench of horse manure as his followers swore oaths under flickering oil lamps. By dawn, the streets pulsed with banners, and the empire's western edge trembled as if a giant had stepped on a fragile vase. Word of the uprising raced across the Danube faster than a gossip chain on Instagram, reaching the marble halls where Sultan Selim lounged in his silk pajamas. He stared at a map plastered with red pins, each one a tiny accusation of betrayal, and felt the weight of centuries of conquest pressing on his shoulders. The western provinces, with their vineyards and cobblestones, now smelled of gunpowder and fear, and the locals whispered about a possible breakup like a broken Netflix series. Selim clenched his fist, torn between unleashing a brutal crackdown that would drown the Balkans in blood and trying a daring diplomatic overture that might sound as absurd as a peace treaty with a pizza delivery guy. Meanwhile, Elise, the empire's sharp-eyed archivist, was digging through dusty ledgers in a damp basement that reeked of mildew and old ink. She uncovered a secret handshake between Arif's rebels and a rival Austro-Hungarian noble house, the von Kratzbergs, whose crest featured a snarling wolf and a half-eaten baguette, an odd nod to their love of French pastries. The documents crackled like static, revealing covert shipments of rifles hidden inside wine barrels, and a love letter that read, "For freedom, or at least a decent Wi-Fi signal." Elise's discovery turned the rebellion from a local squabble into a continental chess game, with the empire suddenly staring at a multi-front crisis that smelled of burnt parchment and desperation. The empire's border towns erupted into a cacophony of clashing swords, shouted curses, and the occasional pop culture shout out, "Winter is coming," echoed from a ragged militia leader, as if the Game of Thrones script had leaked into the 19th century Balkans. Smoke rose like a greasy curtain, coating the sky in a greasy orange that made the sun look like a fried egg. Ottoman artillery boomed, sending shrapnel ricocheting off stone walls, while Austro-Hungarian cavalry thundered in, their horses' hooves drumming a frantic rhythm on the cobblestones. The air tasted metallic, and the cries of wounded civilians blended with the distant wail of a church bell, turning the whole scene into a grotesque symphony of chaos. Faced with the roar of battle and the whisper of diplomacy, Selim paced the palace balcony, the wind tugging at his turban like an impatient child. He could order his janissaries to sweep the rebels away, a move that would make history remember him as the guy who turned the Balkans into a giant kebab grill. Or he could send envoys bearing silk and figs to the von Kratzbergs, hoping a sweet treat might diffuse the fury. The irony was palpable. The empire that once crushed empires now considered bargaining with a noble house that probably ordered takeout on Sundays. In a moment that felt like the climax of a blockbuster movie, Selim lifted his hand, signaling a choice that would either scorch the region or, against all odds, write a new chapter of uneasy peace. The Carpathian winds howled like 1,000 angry banshees as Selim's army trudged over jagged passes, their boots slapping mud into the thin air. Snow clung to the edges of their uniforms, turning the modern steel helmets into glittering icicles. Behind them, the hiss of steam locomotives echoed, a metallic chorus that announced the Ottoman Empire's new love affair with railroads. Selim, eyes narrowed beneath a fur-lined turban, surveyed the horizon where the Danube glimmered like a silver sword. He muttered a half-remembered Turkish proverb about mountains being merely speed bumps for empires on the rise. When the troops finally spilled into the lowlands, the scent of roasted coffee mingled with the acrid bite of gunpowder, a perfume that would make any battlefield perfumer weep. Ottoman cannons, sleek and chrome-polished, roared louder than a stadium of football fans chanting goal, while infantry in crisp, khaki jackets marched in perfect cadence. The soldiers' faces were a patchwork of scarred veterans and fresh recruits whose eyebrows were still twitching from the shock of seeing a tank for the first time. Selim rode a horse that looked like it belonged in a Renaissance painting. Yet its saddle was wired to a telegraph that crackled with orders faster than a teenager's text reply. The Austro-Hungarian scouts, peeking from behind poplar trees, swallowed their fear and spat it back out as nervous chuckles. At the gates of Vienna, the city's spires rose like the teeth of a giant, daring the Ottoman tide to bite. Austro-Hungarian drums thudded a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a marching band gone rogue, while Ottoman bugles answered with a brassy swagger that could wake the dead. Smoke curled from the cannons, painting the sky a bruised purple, and the air tasted of iron and stale pretzels. Selim shouted commands that cut through the clamor, his voice as sharp as a falcon's talon, while his generals exchanged glances that said, "Did we really sign up for this?" The battle swayed like a drunken tango, each side stepping on the other's toes, hoping not to step on a stray horse's poop. Amid the chaos, Elise crouched behind a shattered stone wall, her heart drumming a nervous remix of the Austrian anthem and a K-pop beat she'd heard on a smuggled cassette. She clutched a folded letter from her father, its ink smudged with sweat, reminding her of duty. Yet the sight of Selim's determined gaze sparked an unexpected admiration. The smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby market stall wafted through the smoke, making her stomach growl louder than the artillery. She could hear the distant wail of a violinist playing a mournful tune, as if the city itself were weeping over its own indecision. Every nerve in her body screamed for a decision. Betray her homeland or help the man who seemed to be rewriting history with a swagger that would make a Marvel hero jealous. When the final volley cracked, the ground trembled like a giant's footstep, and the dust settled on a battlefield that looked like a war-zone Instagram filter gone wrong. Selim stood over a broken Austrian banner, his sword slick with crimson and the occasional stray coffee bean, and he turned to Elise with a half-smile that said, "You've got a choice, lady." She felt the weight of centuries pressing on her shoulders, the taste of copper on her tongue, and the absurd realization that she might become a footnote in a textbook titled, "What if the Ottoman Empire never fell?" The decision hung in the air, as fragile as the last slice of schnitzel on a banquet table. With a breath that tasted like ash and ambition, Elise stepped forward, letting the future decide whether the empire would rise like a phoenix or crash like a badly edited CGI dragon. The cannon's smoke curled like lazy dragon breath over the scarred plains of Gallipoli, and the clatter of musket fire finally fell into an uneasy hush. When the last Ottoman flag snapped back into the wind, it fluttered over a field littered with broken sabers, and the sour stink of spilled coffee, soldiers' last comfort. General Selim, his beard slick with sweat and blood, raised his sword not in triumph, but in a weary salute to the surviving enemy. The victory was as fragile as a glass teacup perched on a rickety table, and every crack echoed the looming question of what peace could possibly look like. Yet amid the groans of wounded men, a murmur rose, a promise that the empire might yet rewrite its own ending. Negotiators gathered under a canvas awning that smelled of incense and damp parchment, their voices a chorus of gruff Ottoman baritone and crisp European cadence. They hammered out a treaty that turned the Sultan's throne into a constitutional monarchy, a political makeover as shocking as swapping a horse for a hoverboard. The new charter limited the Sultan's power, installing a parliament that resembled a bustling bazaar, full of debate, bargaining, and the occasional stray cat stealing a fish from a diplomat's plate. Citizens cheered, not because they loved paperwork, but because the prospect of voting felt like finally getting a seat on the roller coaster of history. Ironically, the ink that sealed the peace smelled faintly of cumin and gunpowder, a reminder that progress often walks hand in hand with its own mess. Selim and Elise, once foes, now stood side by side drafting a transcontinental charter that read like a love letter to the world's curiosities. They argued over whether to include a clause protecting the rights of street performers who juggled flaming kebabs, Elise insisting it was essential culture, Selim countering with a joke about fire insurance. Their quill-filled nights were punctuated by the clink of teacups and the distant call to prayer, a soundtrack that made even the stern Ottoman archivists hum along as they signed the final page. A pigeon, perhaps a messenger from the future, dropped a torn piece of a comic strip on the table, reminding them that history loves a good punchline. The charter promised open borders for scholars, artists, and inventors, turning the empire into a giant, glittering workshop of ideas. Within months, steam-powered caravans rumbled across the Bosphorus, belching clouds that smelled like roasted chestnuts and ambition. Engineers from Vienna and Istanbul swapped blueprints over kebab-laden tables, birthing hybrid airships that looked like giant, winged tea kettles, so absurd that even the palace cats stared in bewildered awe. Universities blossomed like desert flowers after rain, their lecture halls echoing with the chatter of Persian poets reciting verses beside French physicists scribbling equations. The world's markets buzzed with spices, silicon, and the occasional stray robot that attempted to sell souvenirs, causing both delight and minor electrical fires. Everywhere, the air thrummed with the electric hum of progress, a soundtrack that made even the oldest minarets feel like they were listening to a rock concert. By the time the sun set over a glittering Istanbul skyline, the Ottoman Empire had become the Netflix of the 19th century, streaming culture, technology, and intrigue across continents. With a subscription you couldn't cancel, travelers marveled at the sight of a Turkish coffee shop next to a Parisian cafe, where patrons debated the merits of Ottoman jazz versus Beethoven's Fifth over a plate of baklava that melted like sweet lava. The empire's influence seeped into distant corners, from the dusty dunes of North Africa to the icy fjords of Scandinavia, proving that a single empire could still shape destiny without needing a time-traveling DeLorean. Yet in the back alleys, street vendors still sold the same gritty, spicy kebabs that had fed soldiers centuries before, reminding everyone that history's flavor never truly changes. And so, under a banner that read Yeni Bir Shafak, a new dawn, people laughed, loved, and built a world that felt both familiar and wildly, deliciously unexpected. At the crack of dawn in 1901, the marble corridors of Topkapi echoed with the clatter of impatient quills, as Sultan Mehmed V stared at a scroll titled Yeni Tanzimat. He was a lanky figure in a silk kaftan, his turban slightly askew like a hipster's beanie, and his eyes flickered with the kind of nervous excitement you get before a first date roller coaster. Visionary reformers, young lawyers who smelled of ink and cheap coffee, had whispered a daring plan into his ear. Throw out the old playbook and rewrite the empire's destiny. The Sultan, half amused and half terrified, gave a curt nod that sent courtiers scrambling like ants at a picnic. Thus began the first chapter of an Ottoman Renaissance, with a scent of fresh parchment and a hint of rebellion hanging in the air. The Yeni Tanzimat unfurled like a banner in the courtyard, its crimson letters catching the midday sun and the gossip of onlookers. First on the agenda, the army, a motley crew of rust-caked rifles and tired soldiers whose uniforms reeked of sweat, mud, and yesterday's kebab. French drill masters arrived with polished boots that clicked against the stone, shouting commands that sounded like a marching band gone rogue. While Ottoman recruits tried to keep up, their faces a mix of determination and bewildered panic. New factories hissed, belching coal smoke that painted the sky a bruised orange, and the clang of steel echoed like a giant's heartbeat. By sunset, the barracks smelled of oil, fresh leather, and a faint hint of ambition, as if the empire had just taken its first sip of espresso. Legal reform was the next beast to tame, and the courtrooms turned into aromatic theaters of justice, where incense mingled with the acrid tang of ink-stained fingers. The ancient Sharia code, dusty as an attic, was swapped for a codified system that borrowed from the French civil code. Think Les Miserables meets Ottoman bureaucracy, minus the tragic love triangles. Judges in crisp robes swapped their wooden gavels for sleek brass ones that rang like a jazz trumpet, startling the old clerks who clutched their prayer beads like security blankets. Citizens lined up, clutching petitions that smelled of sweat, oil, and the sweet perfume of hope, whispering about new rights as if they were gossip about the latest palace scandal. When the first verdict was read, the crowd erupted in cheers that sounded like a chorus of seagulls over the Bosphorus, half triumph, half disbelief. Not everyone applauded the makeover. The conservative ulama, stiff-spined scholars with beards that could hide small birds, saw the reforms as a scandalous makeover show gone too far. They gathered in dimly lit tea houses, sipping bitter say that tasted like burnt leaves, and muttered curses about foreign filth and Western poison, while the steam from their cups curled like ghostly protest banners. Their vocal opposition rang out like a broken oud, discordant and stubborn, threatening to drown the reformist anthem. Yet the Sultan's guards, now sporting crisp new uniforms that smelled faintly of lavender soap, patrolled the streets, their boots thudding against cobblestones with the confidence of a superhero landing. The clash of old and new crackled in the air, a fireworks display of ideology where sparks sometimes hit the market stalls, sending vendors into a frenzy of shouting and dropped figs. Despite the uproar, The Yeni Tanzimat's momentum surged forward like a train barreling through the Anatolian plains, its whistle echoing across villages and cities alike. The army marched in perfect cadence. The courts delivered judgments that felt as fresh as spring rain, and the empire's skyline began to glitter with telegraph wires and domes crowned with copper caps. People whispered in bazaars about a future where Ottoman coffee could be served alongside French croissants without a scandalous gasp. Even the skeptics, after a few nights of restless dreaming, found themselves humming the reform anthem under their breath, as if it were a catchy pop tune from a distant land. Thus, the foundations of reform were laid, solid, gritty, and oddly intoxicating, setting the stage for an Ottoman superpower that would later make the 20th century look like a sequel to a sitcom. The hiss of steam and the clatter of steel rails stitched the Ottoman landscape like a giant, soot-stained seamstress. From the bustling docks of Istanbul to the smoky valleys of Anatolia, locomotives roared past spice markets and wheat fields, kicking up clouds of coal dust that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. Factories sprouted beside the Bosphorus, their furnaces belching orange flames that lit the night like a neon billboard for progress. Workers, men in tar-black shirts, and women balancing baskets of cotton, sweated beneath the relentless hum of looms that sang a rhythm louder than the call to prayer. Even the street dogs seemed to wear tiny hard hats, chasing after stray bolts as if they were golden tickets. The Ottoman diplomats, slick as freshly polished brass, stepped into London's foggy chambers with a briefcase full of railway maps and a smile that said, "We've got the tracks, you bring the tea." The British merchants, ever eager to tap the empire's new veins, offered sweet spun contracts that smelled of mahogany and monopoly. Across the continent, German engineers arrived in crisp uniforms, clutching blueprints that glittered like a sci-fi movie set, promising locomotives that could outrun a cheetah on caffeine. The Sultan's council played a high-stakes game of chess, moving the British pawn forward while keeping the German bishop poised for a technological strike. In the end, the empire signed a pact that let British cotton flood the markets, while German steel bolted the railways together, an odd love triangle that would make even Netflix jealous. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles, those narrow, salty throats of the world, became the empire's bargaining chips, glittering like a jewel on a pirate's map. Ottoman admirals waved flags emblazoned with crescents, inviting foreign ships to dock and pay tribute in oil, tea, and the occasional exotic perfume. Trade treaties inked on parchment smelled of ink and seaweed, each clause promising a slice of the empire's booming industrial pie. The revenue poured into new foundries, where molten iron hissed like a dragon's breath, forging rails that stretched from the capital to the farthest frontier. By the time the sun set over the Golden Horn, the empire's treasury jingled with the clink of coins and the promise of a modern future. It was a bit like watching a superhero origin story. The Ottoman Empire, tired of being the sidekick, put on a cape of steel and steam and declared, "I'm here to save the day and my economy." The British played the role of the cynical mentor, handing over trade deals with a wink that said, "Don't get too comfortable." Meanwhile, the Germans acted as the tech-savvy sidekick, handing over locomotives that sounded like they were powered by 1,000 angry goats. The streets of Istanbul filled with the clamor of progress, but also with the occasional street vendor shouting, "Buy a locomotive, get a kebab free." Even the pigeons seemed to sport tiny goggles, cooing in awe at the industrial fireworks overhead. As the rails stretched farther, the empire felt the pulse of a new age thrum through its veins, louder than any prayer drum. Citizens tasted the metallic tang of progress on their tongues, while the scent of fresh-cut timber from railway sleepers reminded them that nothing stays the same forever. The Sultan, perched like a conductor on a balcony, waved his baton and watched the symphony of pistons, whistles, and diplomatic chatter play out. Critics whispered that the Ottoman machine might squeak, but the empire answered with a grin, a puff of coal smoke, and a promise to keep the world guessing. And so, under the glow of factory lanterns and the glitter of treaty signatures, a modern Ottoman superpower rolled into the 20th century, humming like a well-tuned oud on a rock concert stage. When the guns of August roared across Europe in 1914, the Ottoman Empire stood on a freshly polished balcony of power, its army gleaming with new Krupp cannons and telegraph lines that crackled like a nervous teenager's first text. The scent of gunpowder mixed with the sweet incense of Istanbul's spice bazaars, a reminder that the old world was still breathing beside the new. Soldiers in crisp, khaki uniforms marched through the streets, their boots thudding against cobblestones that had heard the hooves of janissaries centuries before. The Sultan's advisors, half caffeinated and half convinced, whispered that aligning with the Central Powers might finally give the empire its long-awaited comeback tour. Little did they know the drama about to unfold would make even a Netflix binge look tame. At first, the Ottoman flag fluttered proudly beside the German eagle, and field marshals exchanged grim nods over maps stained with ink and sweat. Yet behind the front lines, a secret armistice brewed in a dimly lit cellar beneath the Galata Bridge, where diplomats swapped cigars for coded telegrams like covert baristas. The clatter of typewriter keys echoed the distant artillery, each keystroke a promise to stay out of the mud splattered carnage. When the midnight oil burned low, a hush fell over the room as the Ottoman envoy slipped a sealed parchment into a messenger's satchel, declaring a neutral stance that would make Switzerland blush. The irony was thick enough to choke on, joining the war only to quit before the first trench was even dug. By 1917, the Ottoman Empire had reinvented itself as the world's most unexpected peace broker, hosting the Treaty of Constantinople in a grand hall where chandeliers glittered like fireflies trapped in glass. Delegates from the Entente and the Central Powers shuffled in, their shoes squeaking on marble floors slick with spilled wine, and the occasional stray droplet of blood from a nervous wound. The air hummed with the low murmur of languages, colliding French, German, Turkish, each word punctuated by the occasional cough that sounded suspiciously like a sneeze in a crowded subway. As the treaty ink dried, the Ottoman delegates raised their glasses, the clink resonating like a triumphant drum roll for a band that had just mastered a new instrument. The world gasped, half in awe and half in disbelief, as the empire turned the tables faster than a magician pulling a rabbit out of a fez. The treaty's clauses stitched the empire's borders back together, sealing off the gaping wounds that had threatened to bleed the Anatolian heart dry. Newspapers from London to Buenos Aires ran headlines that read Ottoman Odyssey, from decline to diplomatic dynamo. The scent of fresh ink on those papers mingled with the lingering aroma of roasted coffee in Istanbul's cafes, where patrons cheered and chanted, Vive la neutralité. Even the Kaiser, after a brief moment of stunned silence, cracked a wry smile and muttered, Well, that's one way to avoid the trenches. The empire's newfound prestige spread like wildfire, turning its capital into a hotspot for diplomats, artists, and the occasional curious tourist looking for a selfie with a historic minaret. In the years that followed, the Ottoman Empire strutted onto the world stage with the swagger of a rock star who just dropped a surprise album. Its reformed military, once a clunky relic, now resembled a sleek, high-tech orchestra, each unit playing its part in a symphony of peace rather than war. The irony of a former sick man of Europe becoming the ultimate peacemaker was not lost on anyone, except perhaps the empire's own bureaucrats, who still had to file paperwork in triplicate. As the 20th century rolled on, the Ottoman pivot became the stuff of legend, whispered in taverns and taught in classrooms, a reminder that sometimes the best defense is a well-timed, well-served diplomatic punchline. And so, the empire's story lives on, a reminder that history loves a good plot twist, especially when it comes with a side of kebab and a dash of satire. By the time the 1920s rolled around, The Ottoman Empire had shed its old-school sultanate skin and strutted onto the world stage as a constitutional monarchy with a bustling parliament in Ankara. The marble halls echoed with the clatter of quills, the rustle of silk-tied suits, and the occasional cough of a tired delegate who'd just survived a night of kebab-laden debates. Citizens smelled the sweet perfume of fresh tobacco, mixed with the sour tang of political ambition, drifting from the cafes lining the Bosphorus. Young men in crisp kepi caps whispered that the empire was finally trading its old-world fez for a modern fedora, and the streets buzzed like a beehive on espresso. It was a time when the old empire's ghosts were still rattling their chains, but the new government was busy polishing its boots. In 1924, the government unveiled the Anatolian Space Initiative, a project that sounded like a sci-fi novel, but smelled very much like gunpowder and oil-slicked metal. Engineers huddled on the dusty plateau of Cappadocia, firing rockets that sputtered and roared like angry dragons, their exhaust staining the sky with a coppery haze. Spectators gathered on hilltops, munching on simit and shouting to the moon, while the wind carried the acrid scent of burnt propellant into the night. The first successful launch sent a tin-shaped probe spiraling toward the heavens, and the crowd erupted in cheers louder than a bazaar auction. Even the local goat herders joked that the empire was finally aiming higher than their stubborn goats could ever climb, while rockets were soaring. A quiet revolution was ticking away in a cramped basement beneath the Galata Bridge, where a cadre of Ottoman mathematicians tinkered with early computers. They cobbled together vacuum tube machines that clanked like an over-caffeinated typewriter, dubbing their creation the Ottoman ENIAC, with a wink to the American original. The air was thick with the smell of hot solder and burnt coffee, and every successful calculation sparked a chorus of whistles from the onlookers. Young programmers, some still wearing their schoolboy caps, pranked the machine by feeding it the recipe for baklava, watching it churn out a baffling string of numbers that tasted sweeter than any dessert. By the late 1930s, the empire could crunch census data faster than a street vendor could sell a dozen tea glasses, and the whole nation felt a little more like a futuristic bazaar. On the water, the newly christened Bosphorus fleet sliced through the strait with the swagger of a Hollywood blockbuster, its steel hulls glinting under the sunrise like polished kebab skewers. The flagship, the dreadnought Sultan's Pride, roared its cannons in a thunderous salute that rattled the nearby fish markets and sent seagulls scattering in panic. Sailors sang sea shanties that blended traditional Ottoman folk tunes with the jazzy swing of the era, their voices echoing off the water and mixing with the salty spray and the oily scent of ship's galley. Dockworkers, covered in grease and sweat, laughed at the irony of building a modern navy while still bargaining over the price of a good cup of Turkish coffee. The fleet's presence turned Istanbul into a chessboard where Europe and Asia moved their pieces, and the empire's naval swagger became the talk of cafes from Paris to Tehran. By the end of the 1930s, the Ottoman Empire stood as a decisive player on two continents, its parliament debating treaties while rockets twinkled above, and computers whispered calculations in the background. Diplomats from London and Tokyo arrived smelling the lingering aroma of incense and diesel, only to find themselves caught in a diplomatic tango that felt part ballroom, part battlefield. The empire's leaders, half serious and half joking, compared their geopolitical game to a round of Risk. Except the pieces were real ships, rockets, and punch card machines. When a French envoy asked if the Ottomans were planning a moon landing, the Prime Minister winked and replied, "Only if you promise to bring the cheese." The world watched, half in awe and half in disbelief, as a reformed empire rewrote the script of the 20th century with a mix of grit, gumption, and a dash of cheeky humor. By the 1950s, the Ottoman superpower strutted onto the world stage like a peacock in a tuxedo, its silk banners fluttering over a skyline of glassy skyscrapers and ancient minarets. The streets of Istanbul buzzed with the clatter of trams and the hiss of steam from newly built factories, while cafes spilled coffee aromas that mingled with the salty breeze off the Bosphorus. In the United Nations General Assembly, delegates whispered that the Ottoman delegation had turned the podium into a stage for a dazzling cultural review. Even the security guards wore fez-shaped helmets, a tongue-in-cheek nod to tradition that made the whole assembly grin. Economic muscle thumped through the empire like a drumbeat in a marching band, each beat echoing from the bustling bazaars of Ankara to the high-tech corridors of Izmir's Silicon District. Gold coins clinked against the polished mahogany of merchant tables, while the scent of roasted lamb and fresh pistachios drifted from street stalls, reminding everyone that wealth can be both glittery and greasy. The Ottoman rail network stretched like a metallic serpent, humming past desert oases and oil fields, ferrying crude and cotton alike. By the time a New York Wall Street broker tasted the sweet, smoky flavor of Turkish coffee, he'd already signed a contract for a turbine that could power a whole city. Diplomatically, the empire wove a web of alliances that resembled a giant Turkish carpet, colorful, intricate, and impossible to untangle without a good pair of scissors. At UN sessions, Ottoman envoys dropped subtle hints of Ottoman-style kebab diplomacy, offering plates of spiced meat to soften hard-line positions on decolonization. Suddenly, African and Asian liberation movements found a patron who spoke their language, both literally and figuratively, and the empire's flag fluttered alongside theirs in a chorus of cheers. The irony was delicious. The former imperial power now championed the very idea of self-determination it once denied, earning a reputation as the world's most charismatic rebel with a cause. The cultural mash-up that followed was part Shakespeare, part Rumi, and part Netflix binge-watching. A hybrid East-West civilization that could quote Game of Thrones while reciting the poetry of Hafez. Streets glowed with neon signs advertising kebab-topped sushi, and the air thrummed with the clash of oud strings and electric guitars at rooftop concerts. Scholars in powdered wigs debated quantum mechanics over tea sweetened with rose water, while street vendors sold holographic carpets that projected historic battles onto the pavement. This sensory overload made the world feel like a giant, slightly confused, but irresistibly tasty kebab, every bite a surprise, every bite unforgettable. Today, the Ottoman legacy lingers in the hum of autonomous drones that buzz like swarms of angry bees over the Bosphorus, and in the policy papers that still cite the empire's 1962 Harmony Accord as a model for conflict resolution. Politicians quote Ottoman proverbs in press conferences, and engineers still swear by the durability of 20th century Ottoman steel when their high-tech gadgets glitch. The scent of incense and diesel still mingles in the night air, reminding citizens that progress can be both fragrant and gritty. In the end, the empire's rise and transformation left a world that feels like a living museum, one where the past is constantly rearranged, rescented, and reimagined for the next generation. The sun was sinking behind the Bosphorus when Sultan Selim III slipped through the marble corridors of Topkapi, his silk robes rustling like whispered conspiracies. He gathered a cloaked cadre of scholars, engineers, and a disgruntled coffee house poet in the palace's vaulted hall of the holy relics, where the air smelled of burning incense and wet stone. Lantern light flickered over brass astrolabes, casting long shadows that danced like restless fireflies. "We must aim higher than the Janissaries," the Sultan murmured, his voice echoing off mosaics, as if daring the very heavens to listen. The council members exchanged nervous glances, aware that a single misstep could turn their ambition into a spectacular fireworks show for the Ottoman graveyard. The lead engineer, a wiry man named Hakan al-Mansur, unfurled a vellum sketch that looked like a cross between a cannon and a giant pigeon. He pointed to a copper tube etched with swirling arabesques and declared it could hurl a payload beyond the clouds. Think of it as a really aggressive kebab skewer. A mathematician named Layla, whose eyes glittered like polished onyx, calculated trajectories with a chalky hand, muttering about Newton's ghost and Ottoman gravity. The room erupted in a mixture of nervous laughter and the clatter of teacups, while a court jester whispered, "May the rockets be as reliable as a Netflix binge." Yet beneath the jokes, the schematics glowed with a dangerous promise, the copper humming like a restless beast waiting to be unleashed. Word of the secret project slipped through the spice-laden bazaars to the French envoy, who arrived clutching a baguette and a dossier on British aeronautics. He raised an eyebrow, sipped his tea, and quipped that the Ottomans were finally trying to out-rocket the British tea time. The Europeans, accustomed to steam engines and powdered wigs, scoffed at the notion of a moon-bound empire, yet their eyes glittered with a jealous spark. Selim's court responded with a sarcastic toast. "To the moon, where the Ottoman flag shall flutter above the cheese." The rivalry crackled like static, setting the stage for a centuries-long contest that would make the space race feel like a backyard water balloon fight. The first prototype, affectionately dubbed the Tulip, roared out of the shipyard amid a chorus of clanging hammers and the stench of melted tallow. When the ignition flare flared, a plume of black smoke billowed over the golden horn, smelling of burnt oil and the faint hint of roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors. The rocket sputtered, shuddered, and then shot up like a startled falcon, leaving the onlookers gasping, and some poor janissary's mustache singed. Though the payload fell back into the sea, the spectacle ignited a feverish obsession that spread from the Imperial Academy to the tea houses of Anatolia. Children began drawing moons with Ottoman crescents on the walls, and even the palace cats swatted at the lingering sparks, as if daring the cosmos to answer back. Decades later, under a sky bruised by war and ambition, a sleek silver vessel named Sultan's Dream rose from a hidden launch pad on the plains of Cappadocia, its engines humming like a giant oud. As the rocket pierced the night, the scent of gunpowder mingled with the sweet perfume of night-blooming jasmine, and the Sultan's descendants watched, eyes wide as the moon itself. When the capsule finally kissed the lunar surface, a flag stitched with calligraphy fluttered in the vacuum, prompting a stunned astronaut from a rival nation to mutter, "Did they just moonwalk before Michael?" The triumph was celebrated with a feast of baklava and kebabs, the music blaring a remix of traditional drums, and a synth line that would make a 1980s video game composer weep. And so, the Secret Council's midnight whisper in Topkapi became legend. a reminder that even empires built on stone and silk can reach for the stars, sometimes with a little help from a well-timed joke and a lot of stubborn optimism. When the moon hung low over the Bosphorus, a ragtag crew slipped into the shadow of Galata Tower like thieves in a night market heist. Ottoman alchemists, their beards stained with copper soot, huddled with former janissaries, whose swords now rested beside brass pipes. A French expatriate with a mustache as wild as a comet offered a sketch of a fire-breathing tube, while a Greek clockmaker whispered about timing the blast like a perfect baklava crumble. The workshop sprouted beneath the tower's stone ribs, its windows fogged with steam and the smell of oil, pepper, and ambition. It was the kind of secret that made the city's pigeons coo conspiratorial lullabies. Inside the cramped cellar, the alchemists hammered copper into spirals, chanting verses that sounded suspiciously like rocket fuel recipes, sulfur, charcoal, and a dash of secret spice they called star dust. Actually, just powdered incense. The janissaries, still disciplined, turned their battle cries into rhythmic hammer blows, each strike echoing like a drum roll before a fireworks show. The foreign engineers sketched nozzle shapes on parchment, their ink smearing when a stray cat knocked over a mug of strong Turkish coffee, sending a plume of bitter steam into the air. The scent of molten metal mingled with the sour tang of sweat, while the distant call to prayer clanged like a metronome, reminding them that time was both ally and enemy. Every successful test sent a puff of black smoke up the narrow shaft, and the crew celebrated with a shouted hooray. That startled the neighboring fishmongers. Word of the Sky Forge traveled faster than a market gossip, and the conservative ulama scholars who guarded the holy texts like ferocious cats saw the fire-spitting contraptions as blasphemous sorcery. They gathered in the courtyard of the Grand Mosque, chanting prayers while secretly drafting edicts to seal the workshop's doors forever. Meanwhile, rival courtiers, jealous of the Sultan's new star-chasing project, plotted to sabotage the engines by swapping the copper for rusted tin. Their whispers slipped through silk curtains, carrying the sour smell of fear and the clink of hidden daggers. When a rumor reached the Sultan that the project might summon demons, he ordered a midnight inspection, his robes rustling like a storm-laden sail. The innovators, sensing the tightening noose, slipped their work beneath the bustling bazaars where spices, textiles, and the occasional goat roamed in chaotic harmony. They tunneled through the earth beneath the scent of cumin and fried dough, using abandoned aqueducts as secret corridors. Lanterns flickered over crates of silk, casting shadows that danced like miniature rockets on the walls. The engineers concealed their prototypes inside a hollowed-out kaleem, a woven carpet, its patterns now hiding schematics for thrust chambers. Even the stray cats became unwitting guards, curling atop the hidden engines and purring like tiny, contented rockets awaiting launch. By the time the ulama and courtiers realized the workshop had vanished into the bazaar's maze, the first prototype hissed to life, belching a plume that smelled like burnt incense and triumph. The team cheered, their laughter echoing off stone arches, while a nearby vendor shouted, "Fresh figs," as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. In a twist of cosmic irony, the Sultan, sipping his tea, declared the project a divine sign, mistaking the rocket's roar for the call of a celestial falcon. The hidden forge continued to pulse beneath the market, its engines humming like a secret heartbeat of the empire. And somewhere above, the moon watched, perhaps wondering whether the Ottomans were finally ready to send a kebab-laden payload to its silvery shore. The night the Bosphorus glittered like a spilled bottle of sapphire. The engineers of the secret Yildiz Eye starship rolled the sleek hull onto the hidden launch slip. Lanterns sputtered against the salty wind, and the scent of roasted chestnuts from nearby vendors mingled with the oily tang of machine grease. When the Sultan's courtiers gathered on the cliffs, the prototype's engines roared like 1,000 angry camels, shaking the minarets and sending gulls into a panicked frenzy. The crowd gasped, some whispering that the heavens themselves were about to answer the call of Ottoman ambition. Just as Yildiz Eye lifted off, a thunderous boom cracked the night, and a fireball blossomed into a mushroom of orange and black, painting the sky with the smell of burnt copper and singed silk. The explosion ripped a gaping wound in the clouds, scattering debris that clanged against the water like a chorus of angry cymbals. Spectators screamed, some clutching their prayer beads, while the Sultan's guards scrambled to douse the inferno with buckets of seawater that tasted of brine and panic. The sudden disaster ripped the veil of secrecy, exposing the Starship project to the very eyes that had once dismissed it as a mad poet's dream. In the marble hall of Topkapi, the vizier who championed the Starship, young, sharp-tongued, and half in love with the idea of Ottoman astronauts, stood before a sea of furrowed eyebrows and bearded traditionalists. We were not meant to chase stars, but to rule the earth, snarled the Grand Mufti, waving a ceremonial dagger as if it could slash the flames of progress. The vizier replied with a grin, comparing the failed launch to a bad Turkish coffee, bitter, dark, but still worth a second pour. The court erupted in ironic applause, half mocking, half fearing that the empire might soon need a new prayer for rockets instead of rain. Amid the heated debate, a hulking figure in a navy uniform slipped through the crowd, his navy coat dripping with seawater and the faint scent of tar. Captain Ahmet, long rumored to be a pirate turned patriot, whispered that the sabotage had been orchestrated by a rival faction within the Janissary Corps, not by foreign spies, as the court feared. He produced a rusted fragment of the sabotaged fuel line, its metal etched with a secret sigil known only to the Ottoman fleet's elite engineers. The revelation turned the tide, as the Sultan's admiralty, previously dismissed as sea-bound relics, now claimed a stake in the sky-bound venture. The fallout settled like ash over Istanbul. The progressive vizier earned a grudging respect. The traditionalists muttered about the devil's fireworks, and the hidden navy ally became the empire's unofficial Starfleet commander. Rumors spread that the Sultan, sipping his tea, mused that perhaps the next launch would need a better soundtrack than the sound of exploding pistachios. In a twist worthy of a Marvel post-credit scene, the court ordered a new prototype, this time christened Yildiz Roman II, with a promise that the next explosion would be purely theatrical. And so, under the same moon that once guided caravans across deserts, the Ottoman space race sputtered onward, daring to turn myth into launch codes. When the dust of the first mission finally settled, the Ottoman workshops in the shadow of the Bosphorus roared back to life. Master engineer Hakan Demir, his beard singed by a stray spark, declared the Eye Savesi, the moon warrior, ready for a second sortie. He and his cadre of brass-capped technicians polished its copper ribs until they gleamed like a freshly minted coin. The crew they chose read like a legend from a coffeehouse tale. Layla al-Khalifa, a star-obsessed astronomer with a laugh that could outshine a supernova, and Mehmet the Eagle, a pilot whose daring maneuvers were whispered about in the bazaars. Together they swore on the Sultan's crescent to chase the silvery horizon, no matter how many meteors tried to bite their tail. At dawn, the Eye Savesi hissed out of the launch cradle, its engines coughing up the smell of burnt oil and hot metal, while the crowd below erupted like a chorus of cymbals. Above the Bosphorus, the sky darkened as a solar storm, nature's own fireworks, unleashed a torrent of crackling plasma. Layla's instruments sang with static, and Mehmet's hands trembled like a tambourine in a marching band. Yet he grinned, shouting, "Hold on, we're going to give the sun a run for its money." The ship shuddered as charged particles slapped its hull, leaving a faint ozone scent that reminded the crew of a wet market after a rainstorm. Through the roaring vortex, the Eye Savesi surged forward, its copper skin glowing like a beetle trapped in a lantern. Mid-flight, the storm's fury turned into a chaotic ballet of electromagnetic ribbons, each one flickering like the neon signs of Istanbul's Taksim Square. Mehmet wrestled the controls, his knuckles white, while Layla plotted a course using an ancient astrolabe app. Yes, she had digitized a medieval tool for fun. At one point, a rogue solar flare slammed the cockpit, splattering a hot, metallic dust that tasted like burnt coffee grounds on their tongues. The crew laughed through the pain, Layla quipping, "If we survive this, I'll name the next crater after my mother's kebab recipe." With a final, gut-wrenching thrust, the Savashsi broke free of the storm's grip. The universe outside the porthole, a glittering tapestry of stars, and the faint, lingering hiss of ionized air. The lunar surface rose before them, a powdery plain of gray dust that whispered under the landing gear like an ancient carpet being unfurled. Mehmet eased the vessel onto the sea of tranquility, the descent module kicking up a cloud of fine, silvery powder that clung to their helmets like glitter from a birthday cake. When the engine's sigh finally faded, a deafening silence settled, broken only by the creak of metal and Layla's gasp, half awe, half disbelief. She stepped onto the moon's brittle crust, her boots leaving deep imprints that would outlast the Empire's own marble arches. With a theatrical flourish, Mehmet planted the crescent flag, a silk banner embroidered with a soaring eagle, into the dust, its colors flaring against the black sky as if the moon itself had caught a sunrise. Back on Earth, the Empire's minarets rang with cheers, and a street vendor in Ankara began selling moon kebab sandwiches, claiming they were seasoned with stardust. The Sultan, eyes twinkling like twin moons, declared the landing a triumph that would echo through the ages, even as the engineers muttered about the unexpected dent in the hull that smelled faintly of burnt popcorn. Historians later joked that the Ottoman space race was the only time a sultan's ambition outshot his empire's borders, straight to the moon. Yet, beneath the humor, a profound feeling settled. Humanity could reach for the heavens, and an empire that once ruled seas could now claim a piece of the sky. As the Savashsi rested on the lunar plain, its copper skin reflecting Earth's blue marble, the crew stared up at the stars, wondering which legend would be told next. When the Ottoman flag unfurled on the moon's powdery surface, the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, burst into a riot of fireworks, oud strings, and the scent of roasted chestnuts drifting from street vendors. Poets clutched their quills like rockets, scribbling verses that sang of silver dust kissing their beloved Bosphorus. Artists splashed turquoise and gold across canvases, trying to capture the stark, cratered horizon that looked like a giant, silent amphitheater. Children chased the echo of the landing broadcast, their laughter ricocheting off the minarets, as if the moon itself had whispered a lullaby. Even the ancient hammams smelled of ozone, a reminder that the empire's steam was now mixed with stardust. Across the Bosphorus, Ottoman envoys slipped into European salons with the swagger of astronauts, swapping moon rocks for fine wine and a bewildered British lord's top hat. What began as a cold contest of rockets turned into a diplomatic potluck, where the French offered croissants shaped like tiny rockets, and the Germans presented a sleek, silver telescope that looked suspiciously like a high-tech selfie stick. The Sultan's court laughed at the irony of negotiating peace over the very technology that once threatened to scorch the skies. In a moment that felt like a scene from a sci-fi sitcom, a Dutch merchant tried to barter tulip bulbs for a lunar rover, only to be told the rover ran on moon cheese. An inside joke the Ottomans kept secret from their rivals. By the end of the week, treaties were signed on parchment that smelled faintly of moon dust and incense, sealing a pact of cooperation that would outshine any old rivalry. The moon landing became the empire's new crescent, a glowing emblem of unity that hung in every courtyard and coffeehouse. Citizens gathered around lantern-lit tables, tracing the silhouette of the lunar module with their fingertips, feeling a collective pulse that matched the beat of the drums in the grand bazaar. This shared awe turned old sectarian grudges into whispered jokes about who could bake the fluffiest baklava for the next celebration of Moon Day. Scholars, once locked in dusty debates, now collaborated on projects that sounded like magic, solar sails that fluttered like prayer flags, and hydroponic gardens that grew figs in zero gravity. The empire's future felt as bright as the lunar surface, and the scent of ambition mingled with the salty sea breeze, promising a peaceful, technologically vibrant tomorrow. Patronage flowed like honey from the Sultan's treasury, funding observatories that resembled ornate mosques with domes that reflected starlight like polished brass. Engineers, dressed in traditional kaftans, tinkered with rockets that hissed and sputtered like mischievous cats, their workshops smelling of oil, copper, and the occasional burnt toast from late-night brainstorming sessions. A troupe of street performers even staged a parody of the landing, complete with a camel wearing a makeshift astronaut helmet, drawing roars of laughter that echoed through the Hagia Sophia's arches. Pop culture didn't miss the memo. A local playwright penned a comedy titled Moonstruck in the Ottoman Empire, where the hero's love interest was a sentient telescope that whispered poetry in Persian. The empire's labs buzzed with the same fervor that once powered caravans across deserts, now channeling that energy into silicon chips and satellite dishes that sang the call to prayer across continents. Years later, grandchildren would sit on the marble steps of Topkapi Palace, listening to elders recount the night. The moon became a backyard garden party for an empire that once spanned continents. The legacy of that daring leap glowed in every neon sign advertising space-inspired kebabs. And in the quiet pride of engineers who launched satellites that beamed down images of the Bosphorus at sunrise, humor still lingered in the halls. Students joked that the empire's next great conquest would be a moon-based coffee shop serving lunar latte with a dash of stardust. Yet beneath the jokes, a steady drumbeat of ambition pulsed, guiding the Ottoman world toward a horizon where science, art, and unity danced together like fireflies over the sea. In that bright, moon-kissed future, the crescent shone not just as a symbol of faith, but as a beacon of humanity's boundless curiosity.